Why do I make aliveness the main message of the gym? That's a good question. I've emphasized aliveness time and time again as the primary principle for SBG and as the primary principle, in my opinion, for healthy martial arts training. Everywhere I go. Everything I write about, everything I talk about, every seminar I do, that is the main message. I consider, in a weird way, I consider martial arts, MMA, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as kind of a vehicle for me to teach aliveness. So the message that I'm about, what I'm about, and what I'm trying to get across to people is the idea of aliveness. It's the most important thing. So why is it the most important thing? Well, this is where I try and be clear with people. It's not because I'm trying to give people a term that they can use to divide themselves from others. In other words, we're better than them because we train this way. That's not what it's about. What it is about is healthy training. The reason why I emphasize aliveness to the great degree that I do is because I believe that minus aliveness, martial arts can become something that's unhealthy. Traditional martial arts with the aliveness taken out, is not necessarily a healthy activity. What makes martial arts so healthy, what makes what we do, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and everything else, such a powerful, for lack of a better term, such a powerful form of yoga, is the fact that it's alive. And the reason why those two things are connected, healthy, not just physically, but when I say healthy, I mean psychologically healthy, spiritually healthy. Why aliveness is connected to that is because of authenticity. In other words, if somebody comes to me and they say, I do Tai Chi because I find it a relaxing form of meditation, no problem. In fact, I might even join in with them on that kind of activity. But if they say, I do Tai Chi because I believe it'll cure cancer, then I have an issue. They're free to believe that, but if they're asking my opinion, I'm going to ask them for evidence and research that. And if they're selling that to other people who may be vulnerable because they have cancer, they're looking for a way out, and it's snake oil, then I think that all of us as a society have an obligation to look at that and say, is that really true? Because I believe that the truth, that's what's going to free us up. That's what's going to help us untie the knots. And if what we're doing is not true, if it's not authentic, then it loses everything else. All the positive benefits people talk about, the spiritual benefits of martial arts, the psychological benefits of martial arts, whatever term you want to put on it, all of that comes from the fact that what we do is authentic. If you take that authenticity out and you pretend you're doing something you're not, then it just becomes another way to build up a false sense of self, a false ego, and that's obviously backwards from the real path. So martial arts is very much like that. If you say I do Tai Chi because it's a wonderful form of self-defense, I'm going to ask the same thing I would ask if somebody says they do Tai Chi because they believe it cures cancer. I'm going to ask them to show me. Let me see. Let's test this out against a resisting opponent. Let's see you do your Tai Chi, within the realm of MMA as an example, because for one-on-one fighting, MMA obviously is very functional, right? We can see what works and what doesn't work in that environment. Let's try it there. Because anything physical like that is verifiable within objective reality, like everything else. And so if we want to seek truth, then when we're talking about making actual claims about what we do or what we don't do, we need to verify that. We need to make sure that that's authentic. So it's about that truth with a capital T. It's about authenticity, and that's what makes aliveness so healthy. It's a huge issue. Now, the reason I speak publicly about it all the time, and to be clear, I don't advocate that for everybody. I don't think everybody needs to walk around talking about aliveness. That just happens to be the job that I do at this moment. But the reason I believe it matters so much is because it's important that we're honest within ourselves about our own intentions, and we have to remain skeptical about all forms of authority for ourselves. And so when I talk about aliveness, I'm also giving people kind of a methodology for testing out the information that comes from martial arts. Once somebody understands aliveness, once they really understand, timing, energy, motion, then they can never be bullshitted again in martial arts. They're never going to get led astray by some martial arts charlatan. And I say it time again because it's true. 99% of martial arts, and especially the Asian martial arts, are complete bullshit. And you'll see people in the JKD community as an example, a classic example. There was a great book by Dan Inosanto called Absorb What Is Useful. It has Paul Vunak in it, and he makes side-by-side comparisons with traditional karate and compares that to what they were doing at the time, the Jun Fan and the Kali that they were doing at the Kali Academy. and shows how straight lines and versus the karate blocks and boxing hands versus and so forth and so on. And I think that's fantastic. He was laying out truth for people at a long time. This was long before we had mixed martial arts in this country, and it was brilliant. And what he was saying was absolutely true. But then I see the same people that understand that in the context of comparisons to traditional karate go and do Benjak Silat, traditional Silat. They wouldn't do a Shotokan form, but they'll do a Juru. They wouldn't do a reverse punch or a high outside karate block, but they'll do a Silat punch. And if you look at Silat, it's just as absurd as traditional karate is when it's compared to functional arts like boxing or Muay Thai or Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. You're not going to see a traditional Kung Fu practitioner, a traditional Silat practitioner in the MMA cage anymore, because we understand that if you put them in an MMA cage against the modern athletes and the way these athletes train, they'll get beat up really bad. It's not a sport anymore, it becomes a beating. And we all know that now. But why did that happen? Why did you have a group of people that understood the distinction when compared to the martial arts that came before? Karate was already in this country, and they understood the distinction between karate and what they were doing then. But then fall back into the same trap with other arts that come from other countries that maybe weren't as established. And the answer to that is the understanding of aliveness. You can have somebody be a great fighter, they can be a great kickboxer, they know how to physically do everything in terms of throw punches, or a great judo player, he can toss people on their head. But if they don't understand intellectually why what they're doing, their judo training, which is alive, works better than, say, traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu, then they can get led astray. They might actually come to believe, my judo, it's more for sport. I think it's good, but it's for sport. But, if I was going to do training for the street, quote unquote, I'd do traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu. When in reality, if they were to be matched up against most traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu people, a good judo player would probably pick them up and dump them right on their head. Why? Because they train with aliveness. But not everybody can articulate the difference. And the difference isn't the art itself. The difference is those training methods. If we train traditional Japanese Jiu-Jitsu with the training methods of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's going to look like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it's going to look like submission wrestling, and it's going to work. If we train Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu with the training methods of traditional Japanese Jiu-Jitsu, it's going to look like traditional Japanese Jiu-Jitsu in a very short period of time. Maybe some of the movements will be different, but none of the athletes will actually be able to apply it because you take aliveness out of the equation. So that understanding of aliveness is what gives that athlete, it's what gives that coach, it's what gives that martial artist the ability to go through their entire career and not be bullshitted again. And a lot of people are grateful for that. And I believe that's important. I believe skepticism is important. I'm a big fan of the Amazing Randy, who debunked a lot of charlatans like Uri Geller and other people as long as 30 years ago when he came into this country. And you have a fake psychic like Uri Geller. He was hanging out with people like Henry Kissinger. Now, nobody's going to doubt that Henry Kissinger is a brilliant man. Obviously, he's as worldly as it gets when it comes to being, a steely-eyed realist about the world, and yet he has a really low-level magician, but technically a bad magician, con him. How much Henry Kissinger believed Uri Geller, I don't know. So, but they did, they did have quite a bit of contact. So that just shows you that people can get led astray if they don't understand the principles. Now, if you put Uri Geller in front of an audience of 6 magicians, they'd laugh him off the stage. In fact, that's what happened. The beginning of the end for Uri Geller was when he went on Johnny Carson. And Johnny Carson, he's no Henry Kissinger, but he was a good magician. So he knew that what Uri Geller was doing was silly. He understood the difference between good magic and bad magic. He knew how it worked, and so he could explain it. And that is a brilliant thing. I believe that's a service to society. I think it's important. I think if you look at the state of the world today, if you look at politics, if you look at how human beings relate with each other, if you look at some of the stupid things we do on a global level down to a microscopic level with our interpersonal relationships with people, all of that comes down to, time and time again, oftentimes, a lack of skepticism on our part because we want to buy into something. And that's the thing. It's not that you get conned because the other person's so good and you're so naive. It's because you want to believe what it is they're selling. They want to believe that there's a psychic, or they want to believe that this person can actually talk to the dead. And even though the person that they want to believe in is an obvious con, if you want to believe it bad enough, you'll let yourself be fooled, and that's exactly what happens with martial arts. And it becomes unhealthy. The cure for that is aliveness. Because if aliveness is kept as the main principle, none of that can enter. Right? None of the false, goofy stuff can enter into the curriculum if you keep aliveness as your number one principle, because it gets weeded out on its own. And so that's why I teach it. That's why I emphasize it so much. Again, it's anybody is free to do anything they want to do, but if you are talking about martial arts as a healthy activity, martial arts as a psychologically, mentally, emotionally healthy activity, aliveness has to be key. That's the number one thing.